I'm going to ask Ram Sharma to take the floor. You can amply take your time. It's a difficult subject, namely the treatment of language
Yes, yes,
by Ram Swarup,
yes.
partly in the footsteps of Shri Aurobindo and Anirvan, partly
Yes,
original. So
yes.
please tell us.
Thank you, Dr. Els. Thank you. So can I have my PPT here also? Or should I, or will you allow me to have full screen from my side?
No, you suit yourself.
Because I shared PPT, or my PPTs with, on one of organizers' mail. So if I
Now, if you
need,
push the green button,
okay, it's
share
here.
screen, then
Okay, it's,
normally
right.
your PowerPoint should appear.
All right. Okay, so before I come to the topic, I would like to thank Dr. Elst and other organizing members of this forum for giving me this opportunity to present my views on Shri Ram Sarup's magnum opus, The Word as Revelation. Needless to say that Ram Sarupji was one of the most influential thinkers of the last century. He laid the intellectual foundation for the Hindu movement. His works, along with Sita Ramji and various esteemed thinkers like Dr. Els, David Froleji, uh, Shri Talgiriji, and many others, have inspired thinkers, thousands of thinkers across the world for now Hindu Renaissance. Personally, I consider Ram Sarupji as my guru. His works and the profound insights have shaped my understanding and helped me to make sense of the social, cultural, and political realities of our time. He was not an ordinary scholar, he was a mystique scholar, a very rare combination nowadays, and therefore brought such penetrating insights into subjects that it became the most authoritative work on that subject for future seekers, whether it be communism, Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, or Dharma. Whatever he wrote is brilliant, scholarly, insightful, original, and path breaking. I can go on and sing the praises and glories of life and work of Ram Sarupji for the whole day. You can understand my feeling on this occasion. However, let me come to the topic for today's presentation. Let me state in the beginning, I am not an expert on this subject. I'm still exploring the various dimensions of this work, which I started reading almost 10 to 12 years back. This work of Ram Sarupji is of profound importance from multiple angles. I can't even summarize this work in a single sentence. Though I will definitely state that this work is the finest expositions on the four, level, four levels of language in Indian tradition, namely Para, Pashyanti, Madhyama, Vaikhari. I have often heard about this powerful concept, but could never locate any work that systematically and lucidly expound and explain what we mean by these four levels of language and how they are connected with our human cognitive structure, why they are so important in the study of not only language, but also for the study of mind and reality. As Ram Sarupji has made it clear, any worthwhile inquiry into linguistic must merge into an inquiry into the mind and reality. In my presentation, I'll be comparing the insights of Ram Sarupji with other modern thinkers of linguistics, such as Ferdinand Saussure, Derrida, George Lakoff, Mark Johnson, Ray Jackendoff, and Steven Pinker. So let's begin with this presentation. The title of his book is The Word as Revelation. And as you can see, the subtitles are two, words and their meanings. And we'll discuss later on why we are discussing about words and their meanings, though this book is largely known and remembered for the finest exposition on polytheism. If you want to understand why polytheism exists and where it comes from, so this is the work we must read. But Ram Sarupji has uses linguistics as a tool to explore mind, reality, and the higher dimensions of our own being. So that's why I've given it one more subtitle, and that is polyperception, polysemy, and polytheism. So we'll be moving from polyperception. Polysemy is multiple meanings, and of course, polytheism is many names of gods. So the late Girilal Jain While this book was published, he called to Sitaramji, and I remember this from How I Became a Hindu. And Sitaramji wrote that Girilal Jainji called me and said, Sita, Ram Sarup has written the book of his life, and you have published the book of your life. So this is something very profound and very fundamental work that has laid many ideas that Ram Sarup ji wrote later in Hindu view of Christianity, meditations, and Hinduism in his other works also. So we'll be talking about these things in this lecture. It's about language, mind, and reality. So of course, the first thing that comes into mind is, are words merely labels? Is language external to the thought? Or is there any intrinsic connection between language and mind? Is speech an outer ornament, or is language a utilitarian tool? Because in modern times, we consider language only from the perspective of communication, not from the perspective of cognition or from our own inner being. And does speech reflect deeply laid patterns of the mind? This theme will come again and again. So of course, he will be, Ram Saruji has also discussed, are words God eclipsing or God revealing? Because whenever it comes to language, it is often said that, word cannot capture the, highest essence. It cannot talk about Brahman. It cannot talk about non-duality and consciousness. But our Rishi Munis has written work that also give us insight about not only God eclipsing aspect of words, but God revealing aspects of words also, and how to unlock the higher meanings. And very importantly, which he specifically mentioned, that how to make sense out of the Vedas. Is there any way we can decode the archaic glossary of the oldest sacred scriptures? And because this work, as Dr. Els said, it's not an easy work, and I'll quote Ram Sarupji here, who has written that it is obvious that the problem which we have set out to study is not an easy one, because this goes beyond the mind in the twilight zone or rarefied atmosphere, where thought tends to cease and melt into silence. So that's why he said this is not analytical work only, which can be understood by logic only. This goes to, the, to the realm where your rationality and rational, logic does not apply. It does not mean that it will become irrational. Okay, but you have to go for deeper reason, and that requires a lot of patience and intuitive feeling. So this is what Ram Sarupji himself write on this work. So for me, this is an audacious task to share, about Ram Sarupji's insights on this work. I'll try my best, and of course, whatever sense I make today will be coming from Ram Sarupji. So whatever signals will be coming, it will be from Ram Sarupji, and whatever noise I will make, of course, it's my own personal understanding. So, but before that, we need to understand, because this work uses linguistics as a tool to explore the mind and reality. So we need to understand the core issues of the linguistic studies. And I will take a very brief tour of what are the modern debates on linguistic issues. So let me tell you, if we look at the journey of Western linguistics, it can be captured into three parts. In 19th century, it was mostly about the science of phonetics, till Ferdinand de Saussure came, and he basically resolved many issues of phonetics. So, from William Jones, when Indo-European languages started and the study of Indo-European languages boomed, till 19th century when Ferdinand de Saussure came, phonetics was of the utmost importance for Western linguistics. And then in 20th century came Noam Chomsky, who studied syntax. So basically the second aspect of language began to gain more focus as compared to other. And we know it from, generative grammar and the whole host of issues that come out from, grammatical aspect of language. And now in 21st century, with the end of, 20th century it began, the science of semantic is beginning. And this book particularly talks about semantics rather than about phonetics and syntax. So we need to make it very clear when we are talking about language, mind, and reality. We are not talking about here in this book about the grammatical aspect. We are not talking about the sound aspect. Basically, Ram Sarupji is talking about the semantics aspect. He's talking about what is the relationship words and their meanings In fact, not only the ordinary meaning, but higher meanings also. In fact, Bloomfield also wrote in 1933 that meaning is the weakest point in linguistic studies, because no one knows, from Western linguistic perspective, how does meaning arise in language. So to give you just a brief background where it comes from Western linguistic perspective, there is battle between objective and subjective interpretation of the language. What do we mean by that? So there are two views on language. If you look for last 200 or 300 years, one is called modernism and other is called postmodernism. In modernism, language is considered and mind and reality is considered as an objective reality. And it is studied from logical and rational perspective. And they believe that there is a one-to-one mapping. There is always fixed meaning. Like there is one word and there will be one meaning. There is one sentence and there is one meaning of that sentence. And so on and so forth. So they believe in correspondence theory of truth. If you look at the left-hand side of modernism, you'll find all the characteristics of modernism, and they explore language from this perspective. Of course, I need to tell you here also that before we make any theory of language, we need to understand how language is connected to the reality, and how is reality connected to the mind. So that's why these are our major assumptions of modernism at the objective side of linguistic studies. And their meaning is considered as objective, as compositional, as disembodied. Now this theory, this line of inquiry is culminating into artificial intelligence, where in machine intelligence, they are trying to replicate the structure of language through logic and rationality, like one-to-one mapping. But there is a deep problem with one-to-one mapping. We'll come to the postmodernism and we'll discuss this. But there, it is also important to know who is, pioneer of this study. Like Tarski is there, Frege is there, Montague is there. All these people were pioneers of linguistic studies from objective side. Then there is a subjective study, which we can call postmodernism, which parallelly arose after the Enlightenment. So we can say this tug of war between objectivism and subjectivism has been going for last 500 years. So in postmodernism, they think that reality is always subjective. So you always judge and evaluate things by emotions and feelings and not by logic and reason. And that's why they counter objective linguistic understanding, where they state that there is a one-to-one mapping. So subjectivism and postmodernism state that no, it is not, and there is always one-to-infinite mapping. What does that mean? It means that all meanings are, any sentence can be decoded by number of ways, by whatever people think about it. It's like in modern art. If you just go in front of any modern art piece, they will not ask for any standard meaning. They will leave it upon you that you can decode it as per your whatever ideas is coming in your mind. So meaning is always private and therefore flexible and unstructured. Now this is a huge implication if we go by postmodernism, because we are implying here that individual imparts meaning to sentence or words or language. But the question is, if language is so infinitely malleable, then how can it function? And who is promoting this view and who promoted this view on postmodernism? Of course, many of you might recognize Foucault, Derrida, and Lyotard. Of course, Saussure and Wittgenstein do not come into this, but their studies...
From Bedveer Astro Dating of History.
नमस्कार, क्या खबर? नहीं एक्चुअली कुछ ऐसे ही वो कॉर्नाड एल्स का एक कॉन्फ्रेंस चल रहा था राम स्वरूप पे, तो मैंने कहा चलो वो
should we unmute?
पार्ट नहीं है.
Srinivas, please
हमने
mute.
आपको मेल भेजा. Have you seen it? How to fine tune it, because...
Okay, so Saussure and Wittgenstein do not come into postmodernism group, but they were later on hijacked by postmodernists when they became popular in academia. So in linguistic study, there were always two views. One is objective and another one is subjective. And it went on like this was tug of war, the battle was going on till 1980s, when another aspect come that we call cognitive linguistics. So let me move this slide. I think it's hang. Yes, yes, yes. So in 1980s came two philosophers of language, George Lakoff and Mark Johnson. They are known as co-founder of cognitive linguistics. I hope I'm audible, Dr. Elst, right? Okay. So then Mark Johnson wrote a very important paper in his book, The Body and the Mind. And he stated that there is a crisis in the theory of meaning. Because if we go by any objective parameters of linguistic studies, we cannot have meaning out of it. Because one-to-one mapping is like similar to machine is using language and putting one label against one object. So this labeling of object does not tell us more about meaning. And about subjectivism and postmodernism, it does not make any sense, because if you allow every individual to have its own meaning, then language will be chaos and nothing else. So there he asks these fundamental questions which changed the field of language and brought cognitive linguistics in focus. So the first question that he asked is about polysemy. Polysemy is about multiple meanings. That why there is multiple meanings of word. Why do we see shift, whether it's because of historical reason, whether it's because of social reason, or whether it's because of any accident or any arbitrary changes that are happening. And they begin to explore about metaphors, and their study primarily became important for metaphorical aspects of language. He said that there is no theory of changes in meaning in Western linguistic, neither from objective part nor from subjective part. He also said that because we do not have any theory for changes in meaning, therefore we do not have any theory of semantic structure also. Semantic means that if meaning is not infinitely malleable, if meaning can be finitely malleable, let's say, to make it, to practically language to work, then it requires some sort of a structure to be in place. But what is that structure, we do not know right now. And they try to explore that from metaphorical studies. And they also said that we do not have very proper account of non-Western account of linguistic philosophy. So he was honest enough to admit that whatever we have been discussing so far is purely from Western account of linguistics. So multiple meaning is something very simple. We have seen visual illusions a lot of time, and visual illusions are like, it never allow your cognitive machinery to settle down at one image. So on right hand side, if you see, you can never say that this is only one definite way of looking at the object. Similarly, in sentences, in language, we do not notice it often that how many times we use word that we never understand it from, let's say, objective perspective. So you just look at this left side, you find examples like I see the cat on the mat. Like the cat on the mat is pretty much example of objective way of looking at language. Okay, but I see the cat on the mat, we can say it is also objective way of looking at the language. I see what you mean now completely change the meaning of see from first sentence to another sentence. And as Gaurinath Shastri ji wrote in his work, that we have this uncritical habit of understanding language. That's why we do not pay enough attention on how language works. That's why we never bother about why this shift of language is happening. So next example, you can see the fire smoked a lot, Bill smoked the cigar. All three of these examples have different meaning in each of these examples. So why it is happening? Where does this multiple meanings are coming from? Of course, we can say that it's coming from context and nothing else. And what cognitive linguistics call it, we have this encyclopedic knowledge that allow us to decode such examples. but we will go deeper into this and we'll see what Ram Sarupji has to say about this. So the primary issue in linguistic study is what Ray Jackendoff, the cognitive linguist, call as meaning is the holy grail. And he writes this important passage, which is important not only for the study of language, but a study for the mind and a study for other humanities discipline. He says that meaning is the holy grail, not only of linguistics, but also philosophy, psychology, and neuroscience. Not to mention more distant domains such as cultural and literary theory. Understanding how we mean and how we think is a vital issue for our intuitive sense of ourselves as human beings. For most people, meaning is intuitively the central issue in the study of language, far more important than understanding details of word order and morphology. And this is what we can call, a billion-dollar question, because so far linguistics studies could not decode where the meaning of language is coming from. This is something very similar to what we can compare with, study in physics and science, where there's this, we have the central question of observer, who decode all information that are coming through our senses. So this is a similar question that cognitive linguists are nowadays probing over and pondering over. So we'll be discussing only two areas and what Ram Sarupji has to talk about this. Whether are words and their meanings arbitrary? And if they are arbitrary, then natural question is, how does language function? And where do meanings reside if it's not arbitrary? Where does meaning come from? Of course, in Indian tradition, we have theories of semantic going back to, let's say, sage Bhartrhari, who wrote about Pratibha and all other aspects of consciousness and related things. But here we will be discussing about from Western linguistic point of view and what Ram Sarupji has to say about this. Because if you just ponder over this, you'll find language as a river. It is descending from the highest or the innermost depth of our being, and which we call para, okay, and coming down where we use it as a communication tool, which we can call Vakri, okay. So from para to Vakri, there are language like river descend from the top of the mountain and go to the valley and then merge into ocean. It carries a lot of imprints, impression, influences, and many things. Similarly, when language descend from its highest, the topmost part in our beings and come down to the Vakri level, similarly, it also carries a lot of impressions, a lot of influences, which we can decode through empirical study of language also. But of course, up to the certain limit. So part one is, are words and their meanings arbitrary? And we will see chapter by chapter how Ram Sarupji has decoded this problem. And this problem of arbitrariness does not only belong to linguistic study, it belongs to the larger study of humanity. Because since postmodernism and its equivalent to liberalism has gained prominence in academia, they interpret every subject of humanity either through the lens of relativism, which is dependent on arbitrariness. They say there is nothing, such called absolute reality. And because no absolute reality exists, everything exists in relativeness. And because everything exists in relativeness, then it means everything is arbitrary. So this linguistic question is not only about language, it's about the larger studies of humanities. So the first part that I will be discussing is related to naming, roots, and synonyms. So what is the modern linguistic assumption when it comes to arbitrariness? I would like to share that with you. So modern linguistic assumption is language is arbitrary, conventional, and traditional. And conventional and traditional means at some point of time in history, there were a group of people who came together and decided what word will mean what. Okay. Though we do not have any archaeological evidence for such kind of gathering. So again, the question arises, if it is conventional, who started this? Because archaeology do not prove anything in this aspect. So words have meaning only as parts of system, with each word deriving its meaning solely from its difference from the other words in the system. It is called linguistic structuralism, which Ferdinand Saussure wrote about. Words are acquired habits. Any word could mean anything. Now, the problem is when they write any word could mean anything. Again and again, we have to ask this, if it could mean anything, then how does language function? So if I'm speaking something, how can you understand this? Because you can interpret it in many ways. And this problem of interpretation is the central problem of postmodernism. They say that there is no absolute or standard interpretation. We can interpret things as per our own whims and fancies. But what Ram Sarupji has to say about this? He writes, human speech is a great sacred gift of God and express the deep mysterious life of man's psyche. The same as temples, cathedrals, great music, and great scriptures do. If the present work inculcates a feeling of reverence and holiness about our language, and a sense that we should not abuse it, then its purpose will be served. Now just equate these two ideas. Either modern linguistic assumption is right, or what Shri Ram Sarupji's is writing is, this insight is correct. So we will explore both aspects and we'll see that how Ram Sarupji is building from this arbitrary notion to the non-arbitrariness. Or I can say that, let's say, if there is a randomness and arbitrariness in language, there is a chaos, but how out of this chaos we can build order. So in this chapter, the process of naming, he first asks, are words mere labels to objects? Are words mere reference? And before we come to Ram Sarupji's insight, it's very important to understand Ferdinand Saussure's work and what he writes about this. Because only after his work, this idea became popular that signifier and signified are not at all connected and they are arbitrary. And of course, he was not wrong entirely. Because when you compare one sound with object, you'll find that they do not have any inherent connection. Because we can easily say that what we name by, in English, what we call dog can have any number of words in other languages. So we cannot say that only one word will signify that particular object. So when he was writing it from phonetic perspective. He was discussing phonemes, basically. He was discussing about sound and its relation with words. So that's why he wrote, words are mere referent, words are mere labels, and signifier and signified are both arbitrary. Signifier here means, of course, words, and signified here means object or referent. And he gave a lot of example in his, only the one work that got published posthumously after his death by his disciples. So there are a lot of example in this. Like he traced the journey of words for 200 years, 300 years, 500 years, going back to 1,000 years. And he says this, very appropriate thing, that if you compare signifier, any word and its history for, let's say, 500 years, you will see that it changes a lot. It does not remain same. Like Old English ping became think. The French noun pass, that is step, and the negative adverb pass not, derive historically from a single sign, but now have unconnected meaning. So one word means step, another word means not. So how can we say that words are related to their meaning? Can we not say that words and meaning are arbitrary? So he wrote that in one of his paragraphs that I'm quoting from course in general linguistics, the modern word does not contain a single one of its original element when considered from the viewpoint of the starting point. He is saying that any word you pick up, and go back to 1,000 years, you will not find their phonemes, their combination of alphabet remains same after, let's say, 500 years or 1,000 years. So what you used to call in Latin as a caladium, in modern French, it becomes show, though the meaning remains same. So how can we say that words signify meaning or object? Because both of them are changing. Sometimes words or their phonemes change, sometimes meanings also entirely change. For this, we can take example of dharma also. Dharma earlier meant exploration of consciousness. Now it is popularly known as, creed or belief. Though, of course, we cannot equate it with religion. But the point here is, Saussure was telling us that signifier and signified both changes over the period. Therefore, he establishes it very well through his scholarly work that we cannot say that language is not an arbitrary phenomenon. So this example of a dog he also mentioned, and various other examples. So this became a standard theory after Saussure, after Saussure, that names are just labels and nothing else. So you do not look names for anything deeper. So labeling of an object is an arbitrary phenomena. And if we go by indexical word, of course it applies there. But if we go to the abstract word, then we have a problem. We'll come to that. So after Saussure, Ferdinand Saussure, this study of words and their meaning uh, was never paid any attention because it was considered as a standard theory that they do not have any inherent relationship between them. So whether word have any conceptualization behind name were not explored because everything became arbitrary. Here, I would like to mention one thing that Saussure never mentioned arbitrariness at the level of, he mentioned arbitrariness only at the level of sound only, not beyond that, because he was a scholar of phonetics and phonemes. And he stated this very clearly that when we go beyond the realm of phonemes and come at the level of words, come at the level of sentence, this arbitrariness does not apply. This randomness does not apply because he gave also the concept of linguistic structuralism, where he mentioned that one word is defined by other words or the group of words. Okay, so he never mentioned that whole language as a whole is arbitrary. He mentioned only this at the level of sound. But what really happened is that postmodernism was gaining a lot of popularity. They captured academia in one sense, and they believed in arbitrariness and theory of relativeness, and they hijacked Saussure work later on. So what Ram Sarupji has to say about this, whether sound can really correspond with object? Can we say that this sound belong to this object? He made this very important observation that sound is vastu sarupium. It takes on the form of thing it stands for. Now this is deeper concept I might not discuss here because it will take a lot of much time. But what he observed was that at the level of vacary, at the level of gross sound, we cannot say that it corresponds to gross object. Only at the level of subtle sound, it corresponds to subtle objects. But there he stops his inquiry. He says that because it is a matter of metaphysics, it is a matter of going inside. It cannot be empirically observed, through our scientific tools. So he said that we should not comment upon this for this particular study. But he took one important insight from, let's say, Saussure, and he started observing this. So what Saussure is saying, that onomatopic name, the name that derives from the sound of object, let's say crow. So crow is from count, let's say pigeon is from PP, okay. All these sounds are made by these animals. So why we have named this animal in a certain manner? Because we know that, they belong to this sound. But echoic name is just tip of an iceberg when we name things. If you look at the dictionary, you will find non-echoing name in majority and not echoic name. So of course, sound cannot correspond with object in that sense. So he said that when we go to the non-echoic name, like horse, tiger, cheetah, jackal, okay, like horse is not named because of its neighing, but because of its swiftness. Tiger is named not because of its color, let's say, but because of its movement. Cheetah is named because of its spot and not because of the sound that he makes. Similarly, case with jackal and vesp. Vesp is known for its activity. So he says that non-echoic name is named because of the most striking quality that we observe in there. And he brings cognition into the central role of creating names. And cognition is something which came much later in Western linguistics, as I said, in 1980s. But cognitive perspective is intertwined with linguistic studies in India for thousands of years. So when he is saying about this thing, he is taking this Indian insight of linguistics. But one more interesting thing he mentioned, he asked us to assume, let's say even echoic name exists. And let's say there is arbitrariness and there is a randomness in that. But can this randomness can be created into order? So he gives an example of, let's say, pigeon. He says that we call pigeon, let's say, by random phoneme. We selected P, and we begin to call it pigeon. Okay, but once that phoneme is selected, maybe because of randomness, but later on it loses its randomness, because when we use it for pigeon-hearted and pigeonhole, then we know it is not random. It acquires certain meaning, it acquires certain concept, it acquires certain reality. So from echoic to non-echoic, we see the journey from randomness to, or arbitrariness to, some sort of order. Similarly, you also give example of gurg, let's say from gargle. So the noise that we make in throat, okay. So there we have word of gurg. From this we have French word gorgeous, which means necktie, okay, and then gorgeous. So he says that even if you take the first phoneme as a random sound, later on that randomness get diluted and order begin to get created. So that's why it's important to know what he talks about when what is inside about names. At best, an echoic name is a potential name. True name begins when it acquires a meaning beyond the objective names. This is very important to to grasp. A true name consists not in what it refers to, but in what it means, not in what it denotes, but in what it connotes. It is an intellectual process, though the intellect works subliminally. And he gives here a lot of example to talk about the unity of words, to challenge this dominant myth of arbitrariness and randomness. So in one section he gives example of that how new names are formed, because it is not a case that only naming was done thousands of years back or 2000 years back. Naming is still happening in our day-to-day activity. Okay, new names are coming up every year. Let's say by standard dictionaries publish new words that are coined in particular year. So he gives an example, such as vehicle, telephone, airplane, aeronaut, and astronaut. And he gives their root word also and says that whatever new names we coin, we can trace it back to their older meaning or older roots. So there is nothing new in words, because old concepts are mutated, assimilated, or looked back to adjust to the new ideas. So new ideas look for old ideas to get incorporated. He also talks about historical and sociological insights through various words like property, capital, slave, comrade. What he is trying to make us understand is that these words also shed a lot of insight on what society went through, the cultural history of society, okay, the economic history of society. So let's say, a capital at one point of a time means only chattel, okay, and it derives from kaput. So now capital means, a lot of real estate wealth, let's say, but at one point of time, it only meant wealth in, in bovine, okay. So similarly, we can say that, slave, the slave is derived from word Slav. So it talks about particular history of particular community. So in this sense, he say that if we consider naming as an arbitrary phenomena, we can never gain any insight from this. And he says that we are importing, we are missing very important studies if we are considering this as arbitrary. So what he is saying that word is not mere referent, words always respond, because word is connected with mind. It always responds to the ideas, ideologies, and idiosyncrasies of the age. He gives this beautiful example here to counter what Saussure wrote about. He says that sly, let's say one first example we can take. Sly earlier meant crafty, now it means cunning. Silly earlier meant innocent, now it means feeble or foolish. Temperament, earlier it meant tempus, time or season, now it means mixture. He says that even in changes of meaning, you can find some pattern. They do not change randomly, as it is believed by postmodernists. Even behind changes, you can find that there is some psychic truth. Let's take an example of chivalry and cavalier. So chivalry, he says that it derives from courage, but now the cavalier word is coming from the same root, indifference. So he talks about the Kshatriya value here. He says that when Kshatriya lives in their true spirit, then chivalry means courage. When Kshatriya loses their own values, their own duty, they forget about it. then they begin to exploit people. And from there, it begins to go into the meaning of cavalier. So he is saying that even if you look at the meaning and their changes that are happening over a century, you will find a lot of psychic truth. Because who's responding to these ideas, ideologies, or whatever changes are happening in society? Of course, it is your mind that is responding to these changes. And how it is reflected? Language is the perfect tool to study how mind responded to the changes that happened historically. So of course, after every section, I'll try to give, one unexplored area. So what we can learn from this book also, and what are those areas that are still unexplored, and where, in linguistic studies particularly, we can create a lot of impact. So this is naming and categorization, and I'm giving two quotation. One is from Rig Veda and another is from ancient Greece, Cratylus. So there is this understanding of language, that language cuts form in the ocean of reality. And the similar quotation we find in ancient Greece. It means that language was intertwined, language was assumed to be intertwined with consciousness. Only because it is a property of consciousness, it can cut form into the ocean of reality. And we have forgotten this lost art and science of what I call naming and categorization. And categorization in last 10 to 15 years, if I say last 2 decades, has become the prominent area of study because it tells us a lot about cognition. So language is here, it's primary tool for not only for linguistic studies, but also for cognitive studies. Now there is another chapter on inner psychological connection, which he titled as root. And this is also a wonderful concept that he talks about. This, I think, I haven't read anywhere else. Though in Indo-European language studies, I find a lot of example of, through etymology, you can trace journey from one culture to another through, how words transform from one culture to another. So you can find a lot of social and cultural and historical data. But can same data of Indo-European studies or any other language for that matter can tell something about our psyche also? So the question is, how infinite roots give rise to infinite vocabulary? Of course, this is again one of the prime question of linguistics. So Sanskrit, we see that around 2000 words, and we have legs, 2000 roots, dhatus that they are called, expand into infinite words. So let me directly come to the examples here. Ram Swarup ji asked in this chapter that what connection can we see between statue, stall, statistic, and apostasy? If you see as a word as a fragmented and isolated unit, you can never judge unity of word. Okay, so because he brings, he's trying to build up his case through various, simple example. So he tells us that all these words are connected through roots, and roots unfold organically as per space, time, and circumstances. And it's wonderful to study roots and their expanded words from psychological point of view also. Because how it can happen that a statue can have any relationship with apostasy, or physics can have any relationship with Bauer. So he shares a lot of interesting example in this chapter. So I'll share around 6 examples in this, and all of them are wonderful and gives us a lot of insight about our own psyche. First example is satisfy, satiate, and sad. He says that these 3 words derive from one root. But how can you have opposite meaning from one root? Because satisfy is about happiness, is about joy, and sad is opposite to that. So he says that, root has potential of unfolding in many ways, in variety of ways, and some of them could be opposite in meaning. So he says that which satisfy, who satiate if an inner culture is lacking. So he says that it's not like, group of people got together and they decided that, this single root will unfold in so many words. Unfoldment of words through roots happens so naturally, organically, with interaction of mind with reality and with various changes, vicissitudes we go through. So he is saying that satisfy and sad is deeply connected at least through one root, and it shed important light on our psyche. Then he talks about simplex and simpleton. He says that there is a kind of simplicity that lacks discrimination and borders on stupidity. So, so when you are so simple that you can be cheated by anyone, then we say that it's simpleton. Okay. Then very interesting example of moral and morose. So he says that now, of course, these are two opposite words, moral and morose. So while virtue tends to make some people morose, other feels moral when they are only gloomy and sullen. So he's saying that if morality is not guided and governed by inner intuitions and psyche and only copied from commandments and rules and regulation, then it converts into moroseness. So that's why he's saying that from these words, we can not only understand socio-cultural phenomena, but we can understand psychological phenomena also. Then he shares three more words: beauty, prasanna, prasad, and glad. So beauty, he says that if we trace the root of beauty in different Indo-European language, we'll find that in Latin it has bellus, bonus, bonitas, and Vedic duvas. So what he's saying that if we just trace the root of beauty, the word beauty, through different channels and goes to the root, then in root we'll find that it is connected. What they are connected with? Like beauty is connected with goodness, and goodness is connected with liberality. Similarly, he talks about prasanna and prasad. This is very, very powerful example he is giving here because it talks about yogic praxis. What he's saying is that prasad and prasanna is how they are related. Prasad means to sit down, and then you begin to settle down, and then you grow clear. So he's talking about meditation and yoga practices here, and then you became satisfied. So he's saying that real prasad is to become a prasanna, or real prasannata is when you sit down and meditate. Now, I don't think historically in any point of a time, what do they called as, Brahminical conspiracy, that Brahmins sat together and decided that, these words will be connected. So this idea of looking at language only through the lens of evolution and only through the lens of socio-cultural history cannot provide us insight about such kind of words. Then very interestingly, he also gives example of glad. He says in Germanic stream, there is this glad, which means smooth. In Scandinavia, glad, open space in wood. So he says that glad, of course, means happy. So another root, unfolds in smooth. One more root unfold in glad. Not one more root, the same root unfold in new word in Scandinavia and glad. So he says that mind has perceived a link between joy, light, and space. Otherwise, how can we understand that from one root, one culture took beauty, one culture took goodness, and another culture took liberality? Or for this example, glad, Germanic culture took smooth, evenness, and Scandinavian took glad, open space, and glad in English become happy and joy. It means that we can only study these examples through psychological affinity and nothing else. And that's why this is unexplored area in Indo-European studies. Though I'm not expert in this subject, but whatever limited understanding I have through Ram Swarupji and various works that I have read in Indo-European studies, I have found that a lot of time is spent on socio-cultural aspect and historical aspect. Of course, they would like to prove that Proto-Indo-European language exists and Proto-Indo-European culture exists, and we know all vested interest involved in that. But what is missing in Indo-European studies is that how one root can give rise to so many words. And here I'm not talking only about words, I'm talking about ideas also. For this example, you see that is unfold and expand into at least, let's say, 30 words. But if we reduce these 30 words to few ideas, then these ideas are written in left side. That Sanskrit, it's a with, manner. Greek, it's just means justice also. Then in Latin, it's craft. Then in Old Prussian, it's arm. Then it's German, it's manner. Now, by any logic, if we apply, we cannot understand how with could be connected to arm or arms, let's say. or it could be connected to craft, let's say. Only by psychological unity we can understand how one root unfold in, let's say, 5 to 10 ideas and later into multiple words. Similarly, this example is from salvation and salvage, because salvage is a Christian word, we think. But we forget that whether we take word from English or Latin or Greek, they go back to, pagan roots. Okay, so of course, Christianity manipulated, distorted their meaning over thousands of years. But if we go by their roots, we'll find that salvage and saving doesn't mean saving by sin. It here means that from your fragmented nature, you become whole. Okay, so this also tells us about the philosophy of ancient Greece, that they never believed in, saving through sin or liberation as we understand it in Christianity. So third section of this part is synonyms. I have to make it very swift now. So then he talks about the role of synonyms in perception as well as in cognitive study. He says that perception is directly related with phenomena of synonyms, because to see more than one quality in an object, it is a trait that is the very life breath of a creative consciousness. Because until and unless you can see one object from multiple angles, how can you be creative? Okay, and if we judge any language by their synonyms, we'll find Sanskrit has a lot of synonyms for various objects, which is missing in, at least in English language. So he gives two kind of example, one in which one object can be seen or perceived through many perspectives. So here he gives example of river, fire, water, sun, dog. Interestingly, he gives a lot of example from many to one also. He says that one idea can also be brought from multiple angles. Let's say the third point I'm talking about in the right hand side, many to one, idea of transitoriness. Now, idea of transitoriness can come from a bubble, can come from a comet, can come from a flake of snow also. And there is this multiple objects are there, but they unite where? They unite in mind. They have this experiential unity. And this experiential unity is basically the domain of poets, because poetic literature is built of this, one to many or many to one aspect. They play with this sort of perceiving things from different dimension. Here he also makes this remark that when Saussure say that words are mere reference and words are mere labels. So if you look at the synonyms, in Indo-European studies, you find a lot of example that one synonym is taken by one culture, and another synonym is taken by another culture, and that happens with various culture. Over the period, it happens that culture forget about its root and they do not know the origin of the word. In that case, what happened is they started believing word only as label. So Ram Sarupji write that in due course, they lose consciousness, lose psychological affinity with what they stand for. They degenerate from the significant to the conventional, from the connotative to the denotative, from the unique to the commonplace. No wonder that such names look like labels, because they no longer tell us anything about their objects. They merely indicate. They are mere tags. And this is, I think, pretty much is happening with Indian culture now, because we are losing our roots with Sanskrit words and unity of words that are reflected in Sanskrit. So gradually we are also beginning to take words as label only, because only when you learn language that thoroughly explore the unity of words and the cognitive phenomena behind that can teach you about that words are not mere labels. And this has also one important implication. When words are mere labels, then every object becomes commodity for you, because you cannot see any conceptual phenomena behind that commodity or that object. Once you begin to see that every label or every object has something to tell us about its essence and soul, then we do not exploit that object. So when how words become label, he is also shedding light on why we have started taking things only as object, not as, let's say, energy, as concept, as ideas. So words are not mere labels, that Ram Swarup ji repeatedly tells us, because he tells us that as a reference to physical things, words are separate, inert, and dumb. And here I will just try to contrast this view with Steven Pinker, where he writes that words are only pointer. Because in Western linguistics, they are still stuck with that words are pointer to something in the world. Though he's not entirely wrong in this. But as we have understood so far, that words or the meaning of words do not reside in the object. It resides in the cognitive phenomena that is looking at the object. But still, it's much better than what objective and subjective phenomena was talking about. So Steven Pinker say that meaning of word for natural kind, then like meaning of name is not a description or definition. It cannot be captured by analytical machine, but a pointer to something in the world. So that's why Ram Swarup ji counter. Of course, he does not counter by taking names or by taking any ideologies. He writes that words are pointers to psychic reality and not objects. Objects are as much a pointer as words are a pointer. That's why when you look at fire, so fire burn also, it heat also, it shine also. At the same time, we can see a lot of words that are coming out of fire. If fire is only fire and it is a tool for utilitarian purpose, then we cannot see how naturally and organically fire is connected with energy, vigor, ardor, passion, anger, destruction. Similarly, very interestingly, he gives example of a stone also. A stone can be dead, dumb, or inert if you think word as mere labels. But a stone can also teach you something if you have open mind, if you have sensitivity. Let's say if you are talking from geological perspective, then a stone will never remain a stone. It will have higher purpose of, in evolution, in a geological time scale. From poetic and spiritual perspective, Ram Swarup ji says that a stone can also connote inflexibility, insensitivity, unresponsiveness. At the same time, we have this word of, from humus, homage, humiliate, and humble. So how these meanings are coming up? Do we sit and try to decide which meaning will which come from which word? No. He's saying that meaning resides in mind. Objects or words are only pointers. If we think that meaning resides in word, then we'll be mistaken. If it resides in object, then we will be partially understanding how language functions. And here he asks this very important question, which come first, physical reference or larger conceptions? Because if you look at the word fire and stone and look at the meanings that we get from fire and stone, then we see that conception is higher. At least there are a lot of conception behind one object. So how can one object can give so much conceptions? It should give one-to-one conception, but that is not happening. So we'll come to this point again later on. So humans are not satisfied only by stating the fact or reporting an object. He's saying that we are not a reporter. We just do not share data and information. We always look for some larger meaning in life. So every stone can give you higher meaning. Fire can give you higher meaning. For that matter, anything, any object that you encounter can give higher meaning. So here is the pointer that he's saying that there's this unexplored area, and he gives beautiful example from Roger's thesaurus. He says that in modern time, because of our English, culture and English influence of our modern education, modern Western education, we see that dictionaries are always arranged alphabetically. That was not the case in with Sanskrit studies. Why he says so? He's saying that when you arrange words alphabetically, you always have feeling that words are fragmented, isolated. Words are like, one-to-one mapping you do, and you just go to one word and you try to understand their meaning, okay, from that particular. So word and meaning look more like words and labels. But when you arrange dictionary, let's say it was used to arrange in Sanskrit studies, like through Amar Kosh, or let's say through, Dhatu part, then you will have different idea about language. So even by changing dictionary, you can, or maybe by adding, different kind of dictionary, you can get a lot of good insights from, unity of words and unity of language. Here he gives example of elevation, which is there in Roget's thesaurus, and he says that elevation as a word, if you go in alphabetical dictionary, you will find only one meaning. But Roget's give around 8 to 10 categories, and he says that elevation appear in at least 3 categories. And here you can see that these categories of elevation do not only talk about its physical aspect. Elevation is related to our intellectual aspect. Elevation is related to our moral aspect. So look at the beauty if you try to learn language from such kind of dictionaries. So we come to the second part now, and I'll go very fast now. I've already taken much time. So the second question that we wanted to discuss, the first one was, are words mere labels, or are words and their meaning arbitrary? Second is, if they are not arbitrary, as Ram Sarupji has given us a lot of hint in this 3 or 4 chapters, if meaning resides somewhere, and if there is unity of words that is reflected through unity of mind, okay, or through structure of mind, so where do meanings reside? Here comes the important insights from cognitive linguistics. Cognitive linguistics as a subject started in 1980 with the publication of Metaphors We Live By. So it's the same year, incidentally, when Ram Sarupji also published The Word as Revelation. Of course, I gave the title of this talk, Ram Sarupji, Shri Ram Sarup, a cognitive linguist par excellence. But I do not mean it to say equate anything, because Ram Sarupji's insights are far higher, deeper than what cognitive linguists right now are telling us. But because they broke this tug of war between objectivism and subjectivism and brought some fresh inputs into the linguistic studies, that's why it's important to look at the cognitive linguistics. And the one most important insight that Lekoff and Johnson has given to us. So here the question was, the meaning is the holy grail. But Ram Sarupji is not only talking about meaning, he is talking also about the higher meaning. We'll come to that. So the foundation of cognitive linguistics is built on these theories. Theory of Gestalt, theory of categorization, perceptual symbol systems, embodied cognition. I cannot go into this, these theories. I'll just take one of their ideas and we'll try to see that where does it fit with Ram Sarupji's insight. So the most important insight that comes from cognitive linguistics is that metaphor is not a linguistic feature alone. Now it means that metaphor, which we think as an ornament of language, which we think is something which we use for decorative and poetic purpose, is not only language phenomena. It is intertwined with cognitive processes of the human brain. Human thought is itself metaphorical in nature. This is the most profound insight they gave, and therefore mirrors in language. The study of metaphor will help us understand how our thought process is structured. Now, the importance of this work lies in a fact that such kind of a statement in Western linguistics came after 2000 years. Socrates and Plato talked about language from this perspective. If you read the work of Plato's, particularly Plato's, Cratylus, where Socrates is discussing the linguistic phenomena, there they know that how language is intertwined with cognitive structure. But in last 2000 years, because of Dark Ages and because of derailing of Western society from its own spiritual roots, then the linguistic studies also got derailed. So metaphor is something which talks about cognitive structure. And there they talk about one concept, that is image schema. I'll just try to briefly explain that and we'll come to Ram Sarupji's point. So what happens when you look at the object? Our ordinary perspective is that there is word and there is world. And now even our Sanskrit tradition insight of Nam Roop, we try to decode in the same way. Though Nam and Roop has higher meaning. So do not try to link this with Nam and Roop. This is about word and object. So ordinary perspective is that there is one object and then there is this one word, and we try to correlate that word with that object. And what analytical perspectives are doing from objective side, from machine learning, what they are trying to understand, that when you look at object, you try to extract, point by point, the features of that object. And why you can do that? Because there is, logic, reason behind every object, and you try to study it through analytical perspective. And this is what is happening in machine intelligence also, that they list out, if particular object is there, then let's say dog is there, then they will look for fur, paws, nose, tail, and they will try to define dog from all these characteristics and feature. But if I ask you, do we see object and try to cognize and recognize in this way? No. So what is cognitive perspective? So cognitive linguistics tells us that there is perceptual experience. This is the first is the visual image that you are seeing, and that is extracted and that become abstract image. And from this abstract image, language and thought come. Now this abstract image, let me give, just let me share one more slide and I will try to explain that how it is closely related to what we call Pashyanti. So image schema is something that when you perceive any object, so on right hand side I've given one example. So first is object perceived, then you have visual image that happens at the level of mind. But schema is something which is higher than visual image. Their abstract image is formed. And that abstract image hierarchically, structurally, linearly has its impact not only at the physical level, but at the mental level, at the intellectual level, and much above that. So if you look at the characteristics of image schema, which is given on left hand side, you will find that image schema are pre-conceptual in origin. Of course, I cannot go into the details of all these points, but this is very important that pre-conceptual means that we cannot understand it at the level of perception and at the level of cognition. Okay. Image schema give rise to concept. So it is before concept. Image schema derived from embodied experience. Because this theory is based on embodied cognition of Francisco Varela and other cognitive scientists. So they think that object is primary or matter is primary and all other meanings come, all others meaning are secondary. Image schema are not the same as mental image. They clearly state this. Image schemas are multimodal. Image schemas are analog representation. This is very important point, extending over sensory, mental, intellectual, and abstract patterns. So you come across any object, and when you see that object, that does not only impact your mind, it impacts your sensory senses, that impacts your intellect, that impacts your emotion and everything. And that's why they're saying that multiple meaning of words or multiple meaning in language can only be understood through this image schema, because every word can be understood at the physical level, at the mental level, at the intellectual level, they do not talk, of course, about a spiritual level, but if we go by Indian insight, it can be understood at the spiritual level also. So these are two famous examples from George Lakoff's book, Metaphors We Live By. So first is by over. So if you look at, how this word over is used in different sentences, you'll find that at one place you will see physical meaning like painting is over the bed. If you look at don't overextend yourself, you'll find something related to force or energy. Then she has a strange power over me. He turned the question over in his mind. So you move from physical level to mental level and then to intellectual level. And that happens automatically when we come across any object or any phenomena and try to replicate in our cognitive structure. So this is something also very famous example from cognitive linguistics, up and down. So that up and down is not only about physical thing, it is also about mental thing. That's why we say that I have control over her. She has high standards. He couldn't rise above his emotion. So all physical meanings get replicated over mental level and subsequently over intellectual level. So these structuring of words, or structuring of meaning of one word is very important insight from cognitive linguistics. And Mark Johnson's give us a lot of basic schemas like up and down and over, and he says that these basic schemas produce large number of vocabulary and large number of sentences. Of course, in most of the studies of cognitive linguistics, we do not find anything related to words and their meaning. Basically, they are focusing on sentence. Now, these basic schemas are something very closer to what we call dhatus. Because from dhatus we have multiple ideas, and from multiple ideas we have, infinite words. So this is something very closer to that. And Ram Sarupji also gave us this insight that words derive their meaning from different organs of the mind. Words exist, play the role at the different organs of the mind. So language not only reflect, the outer world, it reflects the peculiarity and structure of the mind. So what Ram Sarupji is saying, I have written on one side, and what cognitive linguists are saying is on other side. Ram Sarupji say that when you encounter word, it affects your your manas, your senses. It affects your feeling. It indicates class. It indicates ideas. It also stands for the psychic truth. I'll share one example for this also, which he has beautifully illustrated in his work. On the other hand, cognitive linguists are also saying the same thing, that this simple image of word and world and word and object does not apply, because when word or object enters, how does word encode that object and encode the meaning happens through this complex process. If I compare this with Indian schema of interpretation, then this closely resemble what we call, at physical level, Deha, Pran, Manas, Buddhi. And this insight of, Indian linguistic tradition basically is used by Ram Sarupji. So he gives one example of thorn, because he very beautifully illustrated an example of a stone also, and, a lot of insights that we can get from dirt, inert, inanimate matter. So he similarly used this example, that when you come across thorn, of course, the first thing that hit you at the object level is that it prickles. Okay. But very soon you start using that prickleness or thorn as a quality in nails and needles also. It also gives rise to words at the level of feeling, like stinging, piercing, biting, cutting. And this is not happening analytically. This is happening very organically, because the way our mind is structured, the way our cognitive structuring is happening. Okay. Then the similar word thorn give rise to idea, that intricate or difficult or vexing situation. So here, when it becomes idea, it can give birth to many new sentences. Okay. And then at the end, it converts into image. So if I say that 4 levels of language that we often discuss in Indian tradition, I think it's beautifully illustrated with this example, that from Vakri to Pashyanti, how things move, or from Pashyanti to Vakri, let's say, because we believe that, Para is first, Pashyanti is second, and then Madhyama and Vakri. So word function at various levels, and that happens automatically, organically, naturally, without our knowing it. Because as Gaurinath Shastri tells us, that we have this uncritical habit of understanding language, and we do not pay enough attention to how language is encoding and decoding meaning. So this is something very similar to simple theory of how we decode words at level of physical and vital, mental and intellectual level. And here Ram Sarupji insight is very important for the science of semantics. And remember, the science of phonetics, the science of syntax, and the science of semantics. 21st century is the science of semantics. And Ram Sarupji has made a very important contribution in this area. Because he says that words derive their meaning from different organs of the mind. Of course, it is very similar to what cognitive linguists are saying, but there is one huge difference in it. Cognitive linguists assume that it is structured linearly, like the word as it exists at physical level, it exists at mental level, it exists at intellectual level. But Ram Sarupji says that every organ, different organs, has its own way of interpreting things. Like what exists at the level of manas will not exist at the level of buddhi. Buddhi conceptualize, manas generalize, and when we look at it at the physical level, it is particularize. So this chart, basically I have tried to derive this idea from Ram Sarupji's work, that language exists at these 4 levels, and how to understand this in a simplistic manner. Okay. So this new dimension of science of semantics is very important to contribute something original in linguistic studies. And India was much ahead in linguistic studies for thousands of years. But for last, I think 40 years, we haven't made any contribution in this area now. He also talks about that this is not only a structure of mind, a cognitive structure that gives meaning. And he brings this very important concept, the Chitta Bhumi, that every level of organ has its purity. How much your mind is purified, how much your intellect is purified. So he says that if we try to, let's say, simplify it, there are two bhumis, Kama Bhumi and Dhyana Bhumi. So Kama Bhumi always will give you surface meaning. And there he talks about how words become labels. And he also talks about that how can labels become words again, with full of vitality, energy, consciousness, and the ideas behind that. And he gives here example. Of course, he doesn't share many example. The simple example that he has given, which became a foundation for his other work also, is that gods became ego god if you go from Dhyan Bhumi to Kama Bhumi. And that's what we see in Abrahamic religion, Semitic religion also. How dharma is converted into religion, how dharma, which used to mean consciousness and exploration of consciousness, is now converted into, at a rasic level, it is conversion. At tamasic level, it's simple belief, creed, and nothing else. He also gives one example of, ancient Greece sacred ceremony, which was called Orgion, a mystery riot, which Christianity distorted the meaning, and later on it is now remembered in English as an orgy, which is nothing but drunken rivalry. This is something very similar to the word that we have seen in recent time transformed from, Jagannath to Juggernaut. So Juggernaut is something very chaotic thing, and Jagannath we understood as something very sacred. So this happens. This could happen at the individual level also, and this could happen at the collective level also. So he says that meanings of word do not only reflect the structure of mind, but the purity of and levels of purity of mind. So the last two slides I'll share. So how to unlock the higher meanings? Again, the important insight is a word is as high and deep and also as shallow and outward as man's mind. Higher meanings reside in the deeper layers of the mind. Meditation helps in uncovering these deeper layers. So if you are approaching Vedic text, coming from the background where you understand word as label, word as referent, okay, then you can never understand what Vedic teaching is, what this Vedic text is talking about. So it is often blamed because of archaic glossary of Vedic text. Ram Sarupji asks, says, are Vedic teachings secret in nature? So he says that from this beautiful illustration going through all these chapters, he says yes, but secrecy is unintended. It is in the nature of things, because we have seen that meaning does not reside in object. Meaning resides in spirit. Meaning resides in the different organs of the spirit, manas, buddhi, and prana. It also resides at the various level of purity. So, of course, when you go and try to understand Vedas, until and unless you have, so he writes here that there is no way of revealing them unless one's life is purified and one's consciousness is raised up. So he says that mind is not, the words are not secular and words are not spiritual. It is your mind which is gross, it is your mind which is spiritual, which imparts meaning to the object and to the text. So that's why he says that higher meanings are confused up with lower and outer labels. That's why in Vedic text, when you come across horse, it means only animal to you. But for those who are born and brought up in Vedic culture with proper meditation and yogic practices, horse could mean 10 more things. I cannot go into that. Okay, I think Michel Danino-ji has written a wonderful article on this demilitarizing the Rig Veda, where he discussed this elaborately. And fire is viewed only from utilitarian perspective, and Soma became intoxicated her only. It has nothing to do with consciousness. So let me end this chapter with polytheism, because that was the primary purpose for this. And from poly-perception, we come to the polytheism, and we look at the multiple names of any simple object, not only of gods. Where does this multiple names of stone come from? Multiple names of fire come from? Multiple names of sun come from? It comes from multiple perception that we have cultivated in our inner being. So let me end this chapter with many names of Krishna, okay, which Ram Sarup ji has shared in his book. So that's why we have many names, because we believe in polyperception. And where does this polyperception come from? It comes from cultivation of mind and intellect through yogic and meditative practices. Thank you.
Yes, thanks a lot. Ramaji, people will
You can stop
not be
sharing.
surprised to learn that this is some sort of a summary of your PhD thesis. It was quite highbrow, and so a little bit of apologies to the people for whom it was a bit advanced, a bit over their heads. However, I want to tell them that they've just had the privilege of witnessing the reclaiming of linguistics for India or for Hinduism. For the last 200 years, some heady, interesting developments have taken place in linguistics, both in comparative linguistics, where I specialize in, but also in pure linguistics, which was the domain of Indian linguists 2,000-3,000 years ago. And so many of the things have happened outside India. India was no part to do it, largely even totally ignorant of it. And now we see that thanks to Ram Sarup, thanks to Anirvan, thanks already to Sri Aurobindo, we see India coming back and making its presence felt again in the sphere of linguistics. So is anybody interested in making a remark to this, or disagreeing with this, or simply asking a question?
I'd like to ask a question.
All right.
Yes.
Yeah. Hello, Ram Sharma ji. First of all, congratulations on a fantastic lecture.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
I haven't experienced something like this in a long time, so obviously it's superb. I have several questions in this. I think we have communicated on this briefly in the past. I'm studying Joanna Jurevich, who's doing a lot of work in interpretation of the Veda using conceptual linguistics terminology, and she has developed a lot of blends. I think conceptual metonymies, conceptual metaphors, and conceptual blends. I think that's the terminology that you use in cognitive linguistics. Of course, she started publishing only around 1994 or so, so probably Ram Sarup ji may not have actually seen any of her work. See, what I would like to understand, and of course, I did not realize until you recently mentioned on Facebook that Ram Sarup ji has actually done some work on cognitive linguistics. And then I immediately downloaded the book, The Word as Revelation and the Names of Gods, but I couldn't really finish reading the book before this meeting today. I noticed that in the book, he mostly talks about names of gods, right? And the polysemy that is involved and the polytheism that we talked about. But has he also addressed the subject of hermeneutics, the Vedic hermeneutics, in his book at all? And that's one question, that I would like to ask. Of course, I mean, the last 200 years, we have the giant of Maharshi Dayananda Saraswati, who has actually reopened this whole subject, based on Yaska's Nirukta. And even if you talk about Yaska's Nirukta, there's also concept of Adi Bhautika, Adi Daivika, and so the concept of multi-layered meaning, which is not the same thing as what you talked about in terms of Pashyanti and Paravaikti and all that. But has Ram Sarup ji written anything else other than this book, or did he have any interest in Vedic hermeneutics? And the second question I have is, has Ram Swarup ji read Martin Heidegger, and is there any sort of an influence of Martin Heidegger on Ram Swarup? Yeah.
Okay. So second question, I cannot comment upon it because I don't have sufficient information regarding that.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe, someone close to Ram Sarup ji could, reply on that. But on first question, whether when it's about Vedic hermeneutics, there are several passages in the book where Ram Sarup ji is stating that, Vedic, when we approach Vedic text, the first thing uh, that boggles our mind is archaic glossary, you can say, and then multiple layers of meaning that is involved. And of course, it also happens with every spiritual text. So Ram Sarup ji, one of the objective of this book, The Word is Revelation, is about how to decode the meaning of Vedic text. Because until and unless we know about the meaning, higher meaning, lower meaning, so we cannot approach the text. So he laid out hermeneutics in the sense of when you approach any text or when you approach sacred text like Vedas, then first you need to understand the connection between language, mind, and reality, and how meaning get decoded in your mind or encoded in your mind. So he has wonderfully explained that how does it happen. And of course, at the second or third last chapter, he writes on Vedic studies, and he says that why all these Western Indologists are failing is because they think that word exists only at one level. Word cannot exist at multiple levels. Okay, so this is profound insight, and this he has proved through empirical studies. It is not like by believing that I believe that Adi Bhautik, Adi Devik, and Adhyatmik, there are three layers. And of course, it's very similar to what we have been talking about in this work. So my answer is he has given us a very powerful framework. Now it's up to us to go to Vedic text the way he has shown to us, okay, through linguistic studies and through sadhana also, because he says that meditation will unfold and uncover the higher layers of meaning. So I think he was primarily interested in Vedic hermeneutics, but his approach was something different.
Okay. Has he written any other papers or any other works other than this book?
The companion volume of this, The Word is Revelation, is meditation. So, of course, it's not about linguistics, but on similar ideas he has explored there also.
There is a question here about the bibliography, essentially, why or where can this listener find any empirical works on precisely the processes of cognition and language formation that are relevant to Ram Swarup's work? I'm just passing the question on.
Now, because in India, for thousands of years, cognition is intertwined with linguistic studies. We have never seen linguistic study from the objective or subjective purpose, as I discussed. So any text you pick up in linguistic studies, you will find cognition will be there, because we think language as a constructive and cognitive process. Okay, so good example to begin with is Bhartrhari. Okay, so Bhartrhari is is the finest example where he discusses and talks about how consciousness, cognition is connected with language. But of course, if you are looking for modern writer, then I will definitely recommend Gaurinath Shastri and R.C. Pandey. They beautifully describe the philosophy of Bhartrhari.
Yes. Okay, another question here. You've heard myself already asking whether Ram Swarup belonged to any specific sampradaya or so.
Yes.
Here is the same question, but specified to his linguistic work, which to the average Hindu will immediately refer to the Mimamsa school.
Right.
What's the relation between traditional Mimamsa? Why did he not continue the state where Mimamsa had left it off, so to speak? Why did he start out on his own?
This is a really fine question, and I'll try to answer this. When Shri Aurobindo wrote The Secret of the Vedas, okay, he mentioned specifically about Mimamsic interpretation of Vedas. He says that it is mostly interpreted from ritualistic point of view. Okay, and Shri Aurobindo tried to explain Vedic verses, Vedic text from symbolical point of view. Okay, the study that was carried forward by Shri Anirvan, extensively and in a very scholarly way. Okay, and Shri Anirvan also repeat the same point when he comes to Mimamsic interpretation of Vedas. He also says that Mimamsic interpretation largely relies on ritualistic aspects of Vedas, okay, and not on, let's say, Gyan Marg, on symbolic aspects of Vedic glossary, Vedic terminology. So the similar study is taken up by Ram Swarupji. So Ram Swarupji comes in the lineage of Shri Aurobindo and then Shri Anirvan, and of course. So you find a similar theme there. They are going for the linguistic study from symbolical point of view rather than from ritualistic point of view.
All right. Professor Sharma, I may point you to the question and answer in writing.
Yes.
That's below in your screen.
Yes.
There are some questions for specific bibliographical data. We cannot have a conversation about that, but if you feel like, giving a few suggestions, we can do that over there. Any other questions or remarks? You see, for me, it is 30 years ago that I read that book. And so I only have a vague recollection. But I remember noting that Ram Swarup had written about the intrinsic emotive value of particular sounds.
Yes.
Like, for instance, a hissing sound is in many languages present in the name of the snake.
Yes.
Not in Sanskrit, but by accident, the word naga is actually related to the English word snake. But in India, the extra hissing sound is missing. But anyway, so that seemed to be an idea that has come to many people in many countries in the early days of linguistics. You see, this was a popular, not very sophisticated theory that words are ultimately all onomatopoeias, that is to say, replicators of sounds. So my question here is very unsophisticated, I admit, but from your highbrow perspective, how would you rate the comment that very many Western linguistics will have at that point? Oh, it's only that. It's, it's again, these piano types with their primitive, unsophisticated ideas that we have risen far above. But how would you rate that?
So, the first chapter of this book, the word is Revelation. It's on, Socrates' theory of sound, okay, where he discusses how sound is connected with object, okay, whether there is any intrinsic relationship between sound and object. Now, Ram Swarupji's insight in this is that at Vakri level, at the gross level, we cannot say and we cannot empirically prove that gross sound correspond to the gross object. Okay, first is this. He says that even if the sound and object correspond, okay, they correspond at the subtle level. Okay, because if you go by the gross object and gross sound, how will you prove it? Because let's say he gives one interesting example of phoneme R, ra, ram, ra, run, ra, rest. So he says that from one phoneme you have rest and one phoneme you have run also. So one is about motion and one is about stability. So you cannot say that this one phoneme can really capture the motion or can really capture the stability. So there he discussed it from Socrates' point of view. And interestingly, Socrates also in, Plato's Cratylus also come to the same conclusion after giving, so many examples of sound and object. And he says that, of course, sound corresponds to object, but not at the ordinary perception level. It corresponds to the subtle level. So this is the same insight which Socrates gave in Cratylus. The same insight is given by Ram Swarupji. So of course, what you are saying is, of course, cannot be empirically proven at the gross level. At the subtle level, you need inner science. And only through inner science, you can understand how does it correlate.
Right. Okay, if there's any last question or remark. In that case, yes, I didn't mention that you teach at the Indus University in Ahmedabad, in the Institute for Indic Studies.
Yes, Center for Indic Studies.
Center for Indic Studies. So similar story for Pankaj Jain, whom I invite to the floor now.
Pankaj Saxena.
Pankaj Saxena, sorry. Okay. Jain was the other fellow, Harshit Jain, right?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Your other colleague.